One of the most widely used artificial sweeteners in the world was discovered because a scientist accidentally licked chemicals off his fingers in a laboratory. Another was discovered when a researcher misunderstood instructions to test a chemical and instead tasted it. Those strange accidents helped launch what is now a multi-billion-dollar diet food industry built on the promise of sweetness without consequences. But decades later, researchers are asking a surprising question. If artificial sweeteners were designed to help prevent obesity and diabetes, why did both rise dramatically during the same decades artificial sweeteners became common in our food supply? Today, we're going to dive into that fascinating story. Welcome to the Becoming Natural podcast. I'm Penny, and I am really glad that you are here today. There are a lot of places I know that you could be spending your time and attention, and it means a lot that you chose to spend part of your day here with me. My hope with every episode is simple: to explore the incredible ways that our bodies were designed, to look at the research together, and to help make complex health information understandable without becoming overwhelming. If you ever want the studies or the resources or downloads that are connected to these conversations, you can always find them at becomingnatural.com. And I am still working on building that website to perfection. All right, so today let's talk about something that has quietly become one of the most common ingredients in modern foods, something that hits very close to home for me. Today's episode is episode 73, The Sweet Lie Behind Sugar-Free, What Artificial Sweeteners Really Do. Artificial sweeteners, sometimes called fake sugars, sometimes referred to as sugar alcohols. There's many names in order to address what they are. Imagine standing in the grocery store checkout line. You've got your kids, you've got your husband, or you're alone, but right there, next to the gum and the magazines, are brightly colored drinks and little packets, all of them labeled sugar-free, 0 calories, diet-friendly. And maybe you've grabbed one before. Maybe someone in your family uses them every day. The promise sounds appealing, all the sweetness, but none of the sugar. Too good to be true, right? You have stood there yourself at some point wondering, is this actually healthier or is this just good marketing? Sneak peek, it's the latter. For me, this became very personal when I discovered I actually don't tolerate fake sugars at all. I consider it a gift after reading that fake sugars, being the chemicals that they are, cannot be digested readily in our bodies. So, contrary to what we are sold, they run around in our bodies, actually making us fatter. Having Crohn's disease and too many hospital stays to count, I was put on a clear liquid diet so many times. And every time that I was severe enough to be admitted to the hospital, I had to have clear liquids. Well, clear liquids that are approved in the hospital food are all sugar-free. Sugar-free Jell-O, sugar-free popsicles, sugar-free Crystal Light, with the idea that they are helping their diabetic patients. Meanwhile, this GI patient was left sipping the only non-sugar-free item in the hospital that was liquid and clear. It was chicken broth made from powder for days on end to prevent my stomach from being in knots and vomiting from sugar-free anything. Another time, I was admitted to the ER in severe pain and distress, and through no fault of the nurse, she was trying to help me get some really nasty medicine swallowed while I was distracted getting a morphine drip from another nurse, and she dumped the oral meds in Crystal Light and told me to just shoot it. However, I had so much going on that I did not stop to ask if it was Crystal Light, which is the ER standard of care, by the way. I should have been smarter, but I was in an excruciating amount of pain, and I just took it. And the minute I swallowed that shot of medicine, I tasted the lemonade and asked if it was Crystal Light. Within seconds, I was vomiting everything back up. My body rejected it immediately, and that's when it clicked. These substances may be 0 calorie, but they are not neutral for our body. Which brings me to sitting with a friend at lunch one day, and she ordered a large fast food meal, burgers and fries, the whole shebang, and no judgment here. I love all of it. And then she said something that made me smile when she said, "I'll have a Diet Coke though. I'm trying to be healthy." And it just made me laugh because somewhere along the way, many of us were taught that if the drink says diet or zero sugar, it somehow cancels out everything else on our plate, almost like a nutritional reset button. But when you start looking more closely at the science behind artificial sweeteners, the story turns out to be much more complicated than that. I regularly retrieve the little colored artificial sweetener packets for my patients, and everyone has their favorite color. We all know the ones. Pink is saccharin, blue is aspartame, yellow is sucralose, and green, the hot new wonderful thing, stevia. None of them good. The ingredient list looks more like something from a chemistry textbook than something from the kitchen. So, how did we end up with something this synthetic in something as simple as a cup of coffee, let alone with a promise as a healthy sugar substitute? What actually is a better form of sweetness? We often swing between extremes. We go from sugar is bad to anything without sugar must be better, and then there are so many gray areas in between. But that's not exactly the full picture, because not all sweetness is created equal. There's a very big difference between something that was created in a lab and something that originally came from the earth. Sugar, in the most original form, obviously comes from sugarcane. It grows, it's harvested, and even though modern sugar is heavily processed, it started as something real. Now, what we typically find in stores today is white, refined sugar that's been heavily processed. It's been bleached. Yes, you're eating bleach, and completely stripped down to zero nutritive value. And because of that, it does behave differently in the body than it originally did. But if you step one layer back from that to something like raw and unbleached cane sugar, you're already closer to something that the body recognizes. And if you step even further into natural sources of sweetness, this is where things get really amazing. Because now we're not just talking about sweetness, we're talking about substances that actually bring something with them. Take honey, or maple syrup, or fruit. They each contain enzymes, antioxidants, and small amounts of vitamins and minerals. There's even some evidence that local honey may support the body's response to seasonal allergens over time. It's not a cure, but a reminder that this is something the body can actually interact with. And then there's maple syrup. Real maple syrup, not Aunt Jemima, but the 100% real maple syrup. Especially the darker varieties contain minerals like manganese and zinc, and it also has a slightly lower glycemic impact than white sugar. Again, that doesn't make it free food, but it does show us something important. The body recognizes them. The body has a pathway for them. They come with structure, they come with context, and they come from something living. And the body knows what to do with them. That doesn't mean we need them in large amounts, but it does mean the body has a clear metabolic pathway for them to operate. The body understands what they are. Now, compare that to artificial sweeteners, compounds that don't exist in nature, that are hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, that the body can't fully break down or use for energy. And now we're asking the body to interpret something completely unfamiliar. So instead of thinking in extremes, it helps to think in layers, perhaps like a sweets pyramid, comparable to our food pyramid. So while whole foods like fruit are at the top, then honey or maple syrup, then refined sugar, and then at the very bottom of that pyramid is artificial sweeteners. And this is where I personally land. If I'm going to have something sweet, I would rather my body understand exactly what it is, even if that means having a little bit of real sugar. And once you see that difference more clearly, you begin to notice something else. The way that these ingredients are presented to us isn't always straightforward. What a surprise. But make no mistake. The big food companies know when we are onto them, and they find creative ways of actually rather quickly changing their ways of listing artificial sweeteners and sugar alcohol ingredients. And this is where things get a little surprising because many of the foods that are marketed as, quote, healthy are often some of the most concentrated source of these horrible sweeteners. Protein bars, flavored yogurts, electrolyte drink mixes, low-carb snacks, even products labeled as natural or keto-friendly. Start reading your labels, my friends. Sometimes the front of the package says one thing, but when you turn it over and read the ingredient list, you'll find multiple forms of artificial sweeteners or sugar alcohols hiding inside. Not always obvious and not always labeled in a way that's easy to recognize at first glance. And this is where learning how to read labels becomes incredibly helpful. Because when sugar is removed, something has to replace it. And more often than not, that replacement is a combination of artificial sweeteners or sugar alcohols. So when you're reading your ingredient labels at the store, sweeteners may appear under several different names, and they are constantly evolving and changing, of course. So I'm going to talk about 3 different categories that can help you recognize the most common ones used in processed foods. So number 1 is artificial sweeteners, which is they're non-nutritive. There is no nutritional value whatsoever. These are synthetic. They're highly processed compounds that provide sweetness with little or no calories. Those include aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, ACE-K, which is short for asulfamane potassium, neotame, advantame, crazy. They just keep coming up with more. So you'll often find these in diet drinks, sugar-free gum, flavored drink packets, protein powders, which, my friends, be wary. These protein powders are loaded with fake sugars because they want you to think that it is healthy. Also, these are found in sugar-free, low-calorie desserts. The next category is sugar alcohols, called polyols. Sugar alcohols are technically carbohydrates, but they are only partially absorbed in the body, which actually many people have a hard time processing them because they will cause nausea, discomfort, or bloating or gas because they're only partially absorbed. Common examples of those include, and listen for the commonality, erythritol, xylitol, sorbitol, maltitol, mannitol, lactitol. Are you catching on? All sugar alcohols end in OL. They are commonly found in sugar-free candy, protein bars, gum, low-carb snacks, diabetic products. So, like I said, sugar-free or sugar alcohols can cause bloating or digestive discomfort when consumed in larger amounts because they're only partially absorbed in our body. All the name-branded sweeteners like Splenda, Sweet and Low, Truvia, all sugar alcohols. So if you're glancing at a label and you see anything ending in OL, that is a sugar alcohol. Walk away. I am going to provide a more inclusive download for you to print and keep close when shopping. But marketers are tricky ones. They are highly skilled at what they do, and their job is not to get you healthy. I know that comes as a surprise. It is to sell their product. So the third category is called natural, and I use that word loosely. High-intensity sweeteners. These are derived from plants, but are often highly refined extracts. Examples of these are stevia extract. I know you might have thought that was healthy, but we're going to talk about that. Monk fruit extract. These are commonly blended with sugar alcohols like erythritol to improve their taste. There's some bitterness in there, and so they try to make them sweeter. So, for example, famous products that I know that lots of people think is healthy is Truvia, and they are mostly erythritol with a small amount of stevia extract. Stevia, the plant, is natural. That is totally true. But most stevia sweeteners sold in packets are highly processed extracts blended with other sweeteners like erythritol, and typically ingredients in Truvia packets are 95 to 99% erythritol, which is a sugar alcohol, and it is usually produced through the fermentation of corn glucose, and then a tiny bit of stevia leaf extract, and then the very famous hiding who knows what natural flavors. So when we go to the grocery store and you're scanning your ingredient labels, if you recognize the names like aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, ACE-K, erythritol, xylitol, you're likely looking at a product sweetened without any traditional sugar. They're trying to make it look like it is sugar-free. So once you learn these names, you will begin noticing them throughout the grocery store. And I am not kidding, it is in everything. And don't stop with medicine. It is in your cough syrup. The one thing I lived on was my Gas X whenever my stomach was in so much pain. Come to find out, it is loaded with fake sugars. So anything you put in your body, look for the fake sugars. Originally, I do think that they were made with good intentions. I really do believe that they were, but what looks natural is not always that simple. Scientists hoped that they could help people, especially diabetics. Sugar raises blood glucose, artificial sweeteners don't, so they should help. And for a while, that made really good sense. But over the time, the story became much more complicated than anyone expected. Many people assume that artificial sweeteners only appear in diet drinks, but once you start reading the labels, they show up in many unexpected places, as I mentioned. So, for example, protein powders. This one is huge because I know people take protein powder on a daily basis, self included, and you have to look at those protein powders because if you're taking this every single day, that is a large shot of fake sugars every single day. It's in flavored yogurts, in electrolyte drink mixes, in sugar-free cough syrup, in chewing gum. And in fact, chewing gum is how I discovered that I could not tolerate the fake sugars because every time I had gum, my stomach got upset. And I started putting two and two together. So sometimes they appear in products people associate with health or wellness, which is why reading ingredient labels can be surprisingly eye-opening, just like the cough syrup and just like the Maalox. So let's start with a little bit of history of artificial sweeteners. We've touched on it already a little bit, but many people assume that artificial sweeteners were carefully invented to solve a health problem. But as I mentioned in the opening, several of them were discovered by accident. The first widely used artificial sweetener was saccharin, discovered in 1879, if you can believe that, long time ago. But a chemist was studying coal tar derivatives, and he noticed that everything he touched tasted incredibly sweet. After investigating, he realized the sweetness came from a compound left on his hands from the laboratory. So yes, the discovery literally happened because someone forgot to wash their hands after working with chemicals, which is a little funny if you think about it. Some of the most common ingredients in our modern diet were discovered because scientists accidentally tasted their lab experiments. Later discoveries followed similar stories. Aspartame was discovered in 1965 when a chemist working on an ulcer medication licked his finger to turn a page and noticed there was an intense sweetness. Sucralose was discovered when a researcher misunderstood the instructions to test a compound and instead tasted the compound. Suddenly, scientists had substances that were hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, but contained almost no calories. What made these discoveries so exciting to scientists was the intensity of that sweetness. Did you know that saccharin is roughly 300 times sweeter than sugar? Aspartame is about 200 times sweeter than sugar. Sucralose, which is Splenda, that everybody seems to use these days, 600 times sweeter than sugar, which means manufacturers only need a tiny amount to create a very, very sweet flavor. So what happens when the body experiences sweetness hundreds of times stronger than anything found in nature? To scientists at the time, that sounded like a breakthrough, especially for people living with diabetes. The original reasoning of the promise seemed straightforward. So replacing that sugar with these compounds should help people manage weight and blood sugar. But diet foods exploded in popularity. Diet drinks, sugar-free yogurt, low-calorie desserts, low-calorie everything under the sun. So even products with the name zero in them, indicating that they were zero sugar and all fake sugars. Artificial sweeteners were widely promoted as a modern nutrition solution. But as decades passed, researchers began noticing something unexpected. Artificial sweeteners surged in popularity during the 1980s and the 1990s because we removed fat in our food products only to discover that fat is what gave the great flavor in our foods. So we trended to low fat by replacing the fat which was assumed at the time to be causing obesity, and now we know it's not, and we replaced that fat with high fructose corn syrup. Well, then we discovered that high fructose corn syrup was actually causing obesity and decided to replace the sweet ingredient with fake sugars. To now realize that diabetics are best counting their overall carbs, not just their sugars alone, but yes, counting their sugars. So, yet during those same decades, rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes continued climbing dramatically. So, now, this does not prove the cause, but long-term observational studies revealed something very interesting. People who consumed diet beverages regularly were often more likely to gain weight over time than those who did not. And that sounds pretty backwards. How could something with 0 calories be linked to weight gain? So we have this interesting paradox here. Artificial sweeteners were originally introduced to help reduce obesity and diabetes, yet during those decades they became widespread. Both conditions increased dramatically. So this doesn't prove artificial sweeteners cause those changes, but artificial sweeteners have been studied for decades. Some compounds, like aspartame, have been classified as possibly carcinogenic, which means evidence is limited and still being investigated. Yikes! Most regulatory agencies still consider them safe within recommended intake levels. But people don't just consume one diet product a day. It's a diet drink with a protein bar that has fake sugar and a cup of yogurt that has aspartame. And pretty soon you've had 10 or more servings of fake sugars in one single day. A growing area of research suggests that these compounds may interact with metabolism, appetite signals, and gut bacteria in ways scientists did not fully anticipate. If you've ever finished a diet drink and noticed yourself reaching for something to snack on a little while later, you're not imagining things. Many people report exactly that experience. Most current-day research has begun focusing less on the cancer side of things and more on the metabolic effects, such as that appetite signaling, insulin response, gut microbiome changes, glucose tolerance, and some observational studies link high artificial sweetener intake with metabolic syndrome, which is diabetes. Ironic that that's what it was created to help, and weight gain. Several studies show artificial sweeteners may alter the gut microbiome, and we're all talking about that microbiome these days, right? Researchers observed that some artificial sweeteners promoted glucose intolerance in mice and in some human participants by altering that gut bacteria. Again, does not prove that disease is causation, but it does show the compounds are not metabolically inert. Artificial sweeteners are best understood as biologically active substances rather than neutral flavorings. They interact with our taste receptors. They influence our brain reward pathways. They may alter our gut bacteria. They affect appetite signaling. And those effects vary from person to person. And this all raises an important scientific question. What is happening inside the body when the sweetness and the calories stop arriving together? To that answer, we have to understand how the brain interprets sweetness. Remember the old test we used to do in elementary school on your tongue where you test the sweet, the sour, the salty? Your brain is not easily fooled. Your brain evolved over thousands of years to interpret sweetness as a signal. So sweetness in our brain historically meant that energy is coming, calories are coming, fuel is coming to your body. So when you taste something sweet, the body actually begins preparing for that incoming glucose. Our hormones shift, digestive enzymes activate, insulin signaling pathways may begin adjusting. Just imagine we say we're drooling at the thought of eating something. Our mouth is watering when we see it. That's what's happening, but that is actually a brain reaction. Scientists actually have a name for the body preparing for food before it even arrives, and it's called the cephalic phase insulin response. When your brain senses sweetness, even before the food ever reaches the stomach, it can begin releasing small amounts of insulin in anticipation of incoming glucose. The body begins preparing for food before the calories even arrive. It is such an incredible machine. Some researchers believe artificial sweeteners may stimulate this early metabolic response, even though the expected calories never arrive. But when sweetness arrives with no calories, the brain receives mixed information. Sweet taste is detected, but the expected energy, it's not there. So researchers believe that this mismatch may lead to several responses: increased hunger signals, altered insulin signaling, and increased cravings later on in the day. Some neuroscientists believe this may lead to increased food-seeking behavior because the brain continues searching for those expected calories, wondering where they are and when they're coming. And this may help explain why some people notice stronger cravings after consuming diet drinks or sugar-free desserts or sugar-free anything. And when you hear that, it starts to connect pretty quickly. Another fascinating area of research involves the dopamine reward system in the brain. Natural sugars activate reward centers that reinforce that energy intake. Artificial sweeteners sometimes activate these pathways differently or incompletely. There's another factor researchers sometimes discuss called sweetness exposure. When our diet regularly contains extremely intense sweetness, far sweeter than anything found in nature, our taste receptors may gradually adapt. Over time, normal foods like fruit may begin tasting less sweet by comparison, which can unintentionally push people toward even sweeter foods to satisfy that taste expectation. It's so frustrating to watch this very common belief of diet or low to no sugar products being pushed in our hospitals when patients are truly getting the worst possible food products that they can get when they should be getting the healthiest food they can get to heal. It is better to have real sugar, real food, whole milk, real butter, all the things our bodies recognize and know how to break down. Nothing removed, so something fake is replacing the real. It's so incredibly maddening. So your digestive system contains trillions of bacteria that influence the metabolism, your immune function, inflammation, brain signaling. We all know what those are, right? It's our gut microbiome. We talk about it all the time. In 2014, researchers published a study showing certain artificial sweeteners altered that gut bacteria in ways that promoted glucose intolerance. One widely discussed study found that certain artificial sweeteners altered that gut bacteria in mice and human volunteers in ways that worsened the glucose tolerance. So when something is glucose intolerant, it means that the body struggles to process that sugar efficiently, which is often an indication or a precursor to metabolic disease, which is type 2 diabetes. In animal models, specific sweeteners shifted bacterial populations that changed that metabolism. This is one of those moments where the body reminds us it's never just doing one thing at a time. A drink that contains 0 calories can still send signals to the brain. It can interact with our taste receptors and even influence that bacteria living inside our digestive system. Even substances with 0 calories may influence the metabolism through the microbiome pathways. Many people assume that 0 calories means 0 metabolic impact, or that sugar-free automatically means healthier, and neither one is true. Artificial sweeteners do contain little or no calories, but that does not necessarily mean the body ignores them. Even without calories, they can still interact with those taste receptors, the appetite signals, and our hormones. Our hormonal pathways are affected. But when you turn a package over and you start reading that ingredient list, many sugar-free foods are still highly processed products containing stabilizers, emulsifiers, and intensely concentrated sweeteners. And this is where it becomes clear. Sugar is not the only part of the picture. So once you start noticing these ingredient names, it becomes surprisingly difficult to stop seeing them. And this does not necessarily mean artificial sweeteners are harmful for everyone. Some people just tolerate them differently. But it does remind us that the body is incredibly complex, and it is incredibly complex for every person. Metabolism isn't influenced by just calories alone. So instead of thinking about artificial sweeteners as simply good or bad, it can be more helpful to think of them as biologically active substances that the body responds to in ways that researchers are actually still exploring. They don't know everything about them. The good news is this doesn't have to be super complicated. A practical approach might include, first, start with reading your ingredient labels and limit the intake of your sugar alcohols or your fake sugars. Limit heavily processed diet foods. They were always going to have fake sugars. Choose whole foods more often than you choose processed foods. And allow getting sweetness from natural sources like fruit, dates. I know they use dates to sweeten a lot of things. Maple syrup. I know that I have a bread recipe that you make with honey instead of sugar. But health rarely comes from changing one ingredient. It usually comes from your overall patterns. So the encouraging part is that taste preferences can shift surprisingly quickly when sweetness exposure changes. Many people have found it helpful to focus on whole food sources of sweetness most of the time, and some simple swaps include, instead of getting strawberry flavored yogurt that has many other ingredients, try getting plain Greek yogurt and adding fresh strawberries to the yogurt. Instead of sugary drinks, try sparkling water with lemon or berries added to it. Instead of packaged desserts with all the preservatives and sugars, try fruit with nut butter or yogurt. Instead of sweetened oatmeal packets, try plain oats with cinnamon or fruit. Healthy habits are built over time, and small shifts in everyday foods can make a meaningful difference without feeling overwhelmed. And when we step back from the science for a moment and we just look at our incredible bodies, these amazing computers, these amazing machines that we have that we have to take care of, sometimes the deeper conversation underneath all of this is simply stewardship. How are you stewarding your body well? Scripture tells us in 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. It's not about perfection. It is about paying attention. It is about learning. It is about caring for the incredible systems that God designed within us. Sometimes the more we learn about the body, the more we realize how thoughtfully it was designed. Our taste receptors, our hormonal signals, our microbial ecosystems. It's a remarkable design. And it's kind of crazy that all the things that we are adding to our diet and to our body these days seem to be just messing all of those things up, self included. I'm nowhere near perfect. In fact, I love sugar. I love a Coke. I understand cravings, but given the choice, I choose real sugar over artificial sugar every single day because the body knows what to do with it. Better yet, getting cane sugar or unbleached raw sugar in the store, the more it's messed with, the worse it is. So I'm going to have a little experiment for you this week, a call to action for you. I want to invite you into a small experiment for the next 5 to 7 days, 7 if you can. Try removing or just reading your labels to remove artificial sweeteners from your routine. No Diet Cokes, no sugar-free gum, which is very hard to find. Gum is a very big culprit, by the way. No drink packets, no sucky candy, all the things that you would be amazed, all the things. Instead, try sweetening your things with fruit, a little honey, or simply allowing your taste buds to reset. The taste receptors actually regenerate roughly every 10 to 14 days, and I can speak to this when I have had to go on special diets for my stomach. It is amazing that when you reintroduce sugar after you have been on a sugar fast, how much less sweet you need in order to be satisfied. Because our perception of sweetness can shift surprisingly quickly. So during that week, notice a few things. Do your cravings change? Does fruit taste sweeter? And does your appetite shift? Many people are surprised that when those artificial sweeteners disappear for a few days, their taste buds recalibrate and they don't need all the sugar anymore. or they're extremely sensitive to the sugar that they try. Most people discover they need less sweet when they reintroduce that sugar after restricting it for a time. Because health is rarely about perfection, it's usually about paying attention and making small adjustments over time. Artificial sweeteners were created with good intentions, but the body is more complex than anyone first realized. I've heard people describe this change in a funny way. They say that their taste buds reset and a strawberry starts tasting like dessert again. And maybe that tells us something important about the way our bodies were designed to experience food. Sometimes the simplest foods remind us what sweetness was meant to taste like, the way it was created for us in the garden. Sometimes the most helpful health choices come not from chasing the newest innovation, but from returning to the foods that our bodies recognize, the foods that were actually created for us with us in mind. If this felt like a conversation that you needed today, I am really glad that we had it. If it gave you something to think about, I invite you to sit with it this week and think about the sugars. Pay attention to what your body is telling you and follow that quiet nudge towards what's feeling more aligned. And if there's someone in your life who's been asking similar questions, please send this their way. Sometimes the right conversation at the right time can make all the difference in the world. Thank you so much for being here. You're not walking this journey alone, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great one.